Toxic is one of the most iconic moves in Pokemon, and it's been around since the very beginning, and it has changed a lot, so we are going to get into it. So you're never going to see Toxic in the first generation it actually exists in, which is the first generation. And you would think, hey, well, RBY games go on for a while, there's lots of recovery moves, extended stalemates, why wouldn't Toxic be useful? The answer is, in Gen 1, Toxic, the bad poison reverts to regular poison when a Pokemon switches out. So you Toxic Chansey, great, and then it switches out and then it's just regular poison. And not that that can't be useful, but it's just so much worse than the other statuses. The big ones, the freeze, sleep, and paralysis. And obviously there's a limit to sleep and freeze. You can only sleep and freeze one of your opponent's Pokemon at a time, but there's no limit to how many Pokemon you can paralyze. And paralysis will help you force more KOs through losing turns far more easily than poison. And of course it has the speed drop that comes with it, so you're just never really going to see Toxic. It's the same reason why people don't really go looking for burns most of the time, because it's not as easy to force KOs with it as with paralysis spam. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course. Just like with Fire Blast on Moltres, then Fire Blasting something like Chansey or Starmie with agility for the latter, of course, then that'll help it force KOs more easily. But that's because Moltres is really strong and Fire Blast is its stab attack. It's not just, oh, I really want to spread burns on the opponent. And with Toxic, it's not really using Toxic for its own sake, but to support the partial trapping moves. The Wrap, the Clamp, the Fire Spin. Because those moves' main drawback is that they do very little damage at a time, so they can run out of PP. Usually, Fire Spin or Clamp, because they have much lower PP than Wrap. But still, it's a concern. And especially with Wrap, because you have to hit a bunch of less than accurate moves consecutively. Or not always consecutively if they're switching around, but you still have to chain a lot together. And when the opponent is Toxic, then they cannot switch around as easily, because suddenly you go from doing 3 to 4% a turn to 6 to 8. So big difference. It can really lock them down more easily. But even still, it's really gimmicky. I'm paying lip service to it, but you will never see it in a high-level game. Only the top-level players have experimented with it, and they're like, yeah, I mean, it's fun and all, but yeah, it's not worthwhile, really. So, if the face of RBY changes in the future, then feel free to come back and laugh at this video, but on August 30th, 2021, then Toxic still has not been seriously highly competitive in Gen 1. So, Gen 2, Toxic... Oh, another reason why Toxic isn't so good in Gen 1 is there's no other passive damage to accentuate it. Leech Seed exists, but it's bad and not used, and there are no entry hazards. And that's precisely what changes about GSC. Not Leech Seed so much, but Spikes, which are pretty much everywhere. So that helps a lot. So you might think... And Paralysis is still very prominent, of course. And a lot of teams focus on spreading one status. You don't have to stick by this rule, but there are teams that really focus on just paralyzing everything in sight. Others want to Toxic everything. So it's not something you really have to consciously think about, but a lot of teams with a certain game plan will work towards that one status. The reason why Toxic is so much better in Gen 2 is, of course, Spikes and phasing moves. So the way Poison works in Gen 2 is that it activates as soon as you perform an action, and that means switching in or using an attacking move. So that stacks really well with phasing. So here's an example. You Toxic a Snorlax, because Snorlax is also super, super dominant, and Toxic is one of the best ways at slowing it down and forcing it to rest. Because resting Snorlax is infinitely more easy to deal with, and it's really hard to force Snorlax to rest through actual damage, reliably anyway. So Toxicing gets the job done, and it's also nice, Zapdos can't come in freely on Skarmory anymore. Being forced to rest is huge. It's not about threatening to KO a lot of Pokemon, because rest is so common. So you think, oh, well, if rest is so common, why is Toxic so common? Well, that's exactly why it's so common. You force the rest. So that's what the Toxic spam teams try to do. They force the rest, and then they are in a good position for their offensive threats like some sort of Snorlax usually, to go wild. So anyway, back to the phasing thing. So let's say you Toxic a Snorlax, and then you force it out before it can rest, which is, not the easiest task, but it's doable. So, or let's say you Toxic a Raikou or something, same idea. Then later on, that Snorlax or that Raikou is going to come in against your Raikou, which has Roar. So the way it works is the Toxic Snorlax will switch in. It'll take 12.5 from Spikes, 12.5 from regular poison. So you actually like it being regular poison because it's doing instant 12.5 as opposed to half that on the first turn. And then you roar it out and free 25%, which doesn't sound like a lot. And then you realize, hey, that's a super effective Stealth Rock hit. So that kind of chip is really, really nasty. So when you pair Spikes and Toxic and Phasing, and you are able to force the opponent around a lot, and then you really, really cut down on their switching ability, and chip damage suddenly racks up a lot quicker. You think it's this super slow game, and then suddenly you are in a dangerous position. So Toxic is really common simply because passive damage is a lot more prominent in this gen, and it's one of the best ways to create offense. So even with the abundance of rest. Matter of fact, the abundance of rest is part of... Like, if Pokemon rested less, I think Toxic is less effective, because against a team that stacks a bunch of explosions, let's say, then you're not really looking to Toxic them, because they're looking to blow up and take you down fast anyway. So it's more about being able to... having such a good weapon in the long game. Okay, so that's Gen 2. Some notable users. Cloyster uses it because there are not many poison immunes that really like switching into its Stab Surf. Gengar is the closest thing that comes close, and even that doesn't really like taking a Stab Surf with Spikes down. And Toxic is really big on Cloyster because it's often used to switch into Snorlax, and with Toxic, you don't just get up Spikes on the Snorlax, but you actually force it to rest. You can do something to it without having to boom, because if you have a Cloyster without Toxic, and you switch in on Snorlax Curse, and, well, you're already not doing anything if you boom immediately, and you won't even get Spikes up. But if you get Spikes up, then you're just giving it more curses, and you're just not going to be doing anything. I mean, if you have a Skarmory or something in the back, then that's nice, but you're still switching into, let's say, a +2 double edge after. That's not going to be pleasant. So Toxic really helps slow Snorlax down. Putting it on a timer is a really, really big deal. So that's Cloyster. Fortress uses it for similar purposes. Fori is a lot more blanked by Gengar, so it's not as automatic an addition, but it's the same idea. You slow down Snorlax that doesn't have a fire move, generally an effective move to throw out, and it's a lot less common on Fori, though, because it has... Fori can use Spin and Explosion on the same set, so you're trying to fit that, you're trying to fit things like HP Fire, HP Ghost, Giga Drain. So, it's good, but not as common. I will mention Toxic Gengar, which is underrated. Normally, you think, defensive Ghost with Toxic, Misdreavus. Yeah, sure, Misdreavus is a great Toxic user, slowing down Snorlax and just generally spreading passive damage. But Gengar is also surprisingly good in the role, because it can use Toxic Rest, Ice Punch, Thunderbolt, and it kind of acts like a Raikou. Not in that it's really a perfect wall like Raikou, but in that it's a good defensive Pokemon because it has a lot of immunities and it's fast and it has great power and coverage. So it kind of becomes this little Swiss Army knife of passive damage utility. So yeah, Toxic is really nice because that way, especially with Rest, and it works really well with Blissey, so you can run Heal Bell to wake it up instantly, and Light Screen to protect yourself from pursuit. The main thing Toxic Gengar does is Toxic and Rest with Gengar, it lets you completely ruin Umbreon, whereas otherwise Umbreon is the most reliable thing at getting a trap off, and with Rest you just sit on it. It needs like multiple pursuit crits multiple consecutive pursuit crits at that. And yeah, with Toxic, you can even escape from it, take the big pursuit, and then rest up later, and you're fine. With Light Screen, it's even easier. And you can do something similar against T-Tar, which is obviously more instantly threatening, but same idea. Makes you a sturdy spin blocker in long games. Another really big thing Rest Gengar does is it lets you sit on Snorlax that runs Flamethrower as its coverage, because usually with Flamethrower lax, then you think, oh, I'm going to wear down Gengar over time with Spikes and Flamethrower chip. And with Rest, none of that. So it's a really cool set. Hard to fit, obviously. It's very specific, but I did want to mention it because it is really awesome. Other Toxicers, we already went over Misdreavus, which is pretty much exactly what you'd expect. You know, Toxic and Rest, and Thunderbolt or Psychic, Sleep Talk, Protect, Pain Split, that kind of thing. Raikou is a really good Toxic user, simply because it lets it force rests more instantly and easily from Snorlax and opposing Raikou, and those are two really big matchups that Raikou finds itself in a lot. It's also generally nice to cripple something like a Golem. It's because you can run HP Water, but then you're not as good against Lax, and you lose the bulk. You're walled by Eggy, and Toxic is kind of like a catch-all, when you really don't want to be going one-on-one with Steelix and Nidoking most of the time anyway. So those guys are a lot more manageable. So Toxic Raikou, very good set. Skarmory, that's kind of a no-brainer. You know, you cripple Snorlax, you make it harder for the Electrics to switch in safely. Generally nice, like if for things like Rhydon. You know, Curse Rhydon gives non-toxic Skarmory a ton of trouble, but with Toxic, then Skarmory is as hard a counter as you get. Toxic ruins Marowak really nicely. You know, that's the nice thing about it. Even if Marowak has Fire Blast, like it should, then you will still be able to poison it and then get out of there, as opposed to just drill pecking and, you know, not really. You know, once you Toxic something, you put it on a timer, and I have a whole video dedicated to how important that is. It's called the power of passive damage. It's kind of a big deal. So, yeah, Toxic Skarmory is kind of a no-brainer. Snorlax is actually, we haven't seen its Toxic set used in a while, but Double-Edged Flamethrower, Toxic Rest, you pretty much Flamethrower anything that isn't a Toxic immunity. Like, you know, Gengar is going to get worn down by Chip, and Spikes, and Flamethrower, because most of the time they're not going to be running Rest. Like, 99 times out of 100, if not more. So, Flamethrower keeps Skarmory out of your face, Fortress out of your face, and something like Nidoking isn't going to want Steelix too, much more efficiently than Earthquake. And that way you can just Toxic everything, you know, and Nidoking isn't going to want to try and take your double edges, so. Yeah, the Toxic Lax is a very cool set for just kind of spreading mayhem on the opposing team. It's very hard to stop it, so a really cool set on Toxic Stall teams. Toxic Starmie technically exists, not really a set, but it's something that Starmie could very viably run, because again, Snorlax and Electrics. Those are some big targets, so. And it's also really nice because if Cloyster stays in and tries to Toxic you as you spin, then you Toxic it, and then suddenly it's on the timer. That's a really underrated use of it. And it has more general utility against Lax and the Electrics than Thunder would if you're trying something similar. So, yeah, so Steelix doesn't use it. Suicune, Suicune used to run, what's it called, Roar quite a lot. That used to be its old standard, but honestly, ever since I started playing GSC, I have always loved Surf, Toxic, Rest Talk. Nothing else comes close. It's just, it's unbelievable how good it is. And it Toxics pretty much everything for the same reason as Cloyster. It has an even higher base special attack stat, so you're really not switching any Toxic immunities into it. And it has so much bulk, and it has so much longevity. So, yeah, Suicune is hard to fit on teams. It's really only for defensive stuff, but it is still a really, really solid Pokemon. Surf, Toxic, Rest Talk, Toxic things in your sleep, never go down. You know, the Electrics don't like switching into you. You Toxic them, you switch out. If they haven't rested, the next time they're going to take your Stab, Surf, and Toxic, and then they're getting forced to rest, and then they're exploitable, that kind of thing. I'm just going to mention Toxic Umbreon as being a very obvious choice, because Pursuit, Charm, Toxic, Moonlight. Moonlight PP kind of sucks, but it's still a good set. You can do cutesy stuff with Toxic and Rest Talk, but it's generally not advisable. Umbreon's standard set is Pursuit, Charm, Rest Talk. But with Toxic set is obviously really nice, so you actually leave lasting damage on things like Snorlax, and so you actually threaten switch-ins like Zapdos and Raikou and even Tyranitar, because you know a lot of people when they have T-Tar and they see an Umbreon, they throw T-Tar into Umbreon and they don't even roar it out or anything. They just hope Umbreon stays in so they get free leftovers. And with Toxic, it's completely out the window. Oh, and Toxic is also really good on Mean Look Pass in case they're trying to phase you with something like Golem or T-Tar, because suddenly they're on a timer. So. Then Zapdos can Toxic, generally not advisable. But I did just want to conclude this with Toxic Tyranitar, which is a really underrated set. It's hard to fit. It's kind of awkward to fit, but it's really worth the effort to make it fit on your moveset, simply because it hits pretty much every one of T-Tar's switch-ins. Because it runs Flamethrower or Fire Blast really easily, so... And if you run something like Ice Beam or Earthquake for Nidoking, then that's not coming in. And being able to... Because T-Tar has that nice normal resist, but it struggles to actually damage Snorlax a lot of the time. So this lets you do something there. It cripples things like Waters and Rhydon, and it's just generally a very effective thing to have. It's hard to really fit into the set, but really, really worth the effort. Not for every team, obviously. So then others, Articuno can run like Ice Beam, Toxic, Rest Talk. That's a pretty good set, but Articuno's niche. Donphan can't really fit it. Yeah, neither can Dragonite. And the BLs, not really crazy about Toxic on any of these guys. But I guess Spin, Tentacruel, the defensive one could. But yeah, that's Toxic and GSC. I'm taking my bathroom break early, even though I went to the bathroom just before this, because I'm just that hydrated. So, BRB. I wanted to mention something else before we move on to Gen 3, which is that since Toxic is so strong, then a Toxic immunity is obviously really valuable. And Steelix has a tough time really being threatening to stall, because it's always, deathly afraid of Fortress, and but the Toxic immunity makes it hard for things like Skarmory to wear it down. And when a really nice setup for offense is when Steelix pairs with Gengar and Nidoking as well. That's a really great team with Zaplax, Cloy in the back. And that way you have 3 Toxic immunities who are doing other things as well, of course. But it means that, often Gengar and Nidoking are used as switch-ins to something like Skarmory as opposed to the Electric, simply because of their Toxic immunity. And especially on Gengar and Nidoking, their Toxic immunity is what lets offense stick around against Toxic spamming stall teams so easily. So, and lets them harass the stall team over the course of a game. So, those are really important traits of theirs. And yeah, I wanted to mention that. All right, so next up, we have Gen 3, and of course, Toxic gets way better here because it no longer, well, a lot of things. First of all, it no longer resets to regular poison once they switch out. I mean, like, the Toxic counter will reset if you switch out and come back in, but Gen 3 is where the Toxic we all know and love came into being. You're badly poisoned, and you will be badly poisoned when you come in again. So that's one thing. Another thing is that there's a lot more passive damage flying around. Leech Seed is really good now, and there's Celebi around to spam it, so there's that. Then there's also the fact that Spikes has 3 layers, which is really nice, or 2 or 3 layers. You can't automatically get all 3 of them up, but that helps. And the biggest one, of course, is, did I just say of course twice? I don't even know, my brain's frying. The biggest one is Tyranitar's ever-present Sandstream. So the clock ticks really quickly with Toxic in this gen, and but that's another reason why the new Steel types, Jirachi and Metagross, are really helpful because they don't take damage from Sand or Toxic. So I've mentioned the TSS combination in my videos before, but if you don't know what that stands for, it's Toxic, Sand, and Spikes. They're the big 3 of passive damage in this tier, and they're so strong and so instantly easy to set up that a lot of teams are built around exploiting their passive damage. It's not even necessarily about passive damage just to try to stall the entire team out. It's just, oh, well, I'm going to TSS the opposing team until it's easy to clean them up with my late game Starmie or Aerodactyl or Zapdos or whatever. So A lot of the advanced metagame, if your team cannot handle TSS, it is a bad team, end of story. Now, there are a lot of ways you can handle TSS. You don't necessarily have to fall back on defensive measures like, oh, I need sand immunities and toxic immunities and rapid spin and weather clearing and all that. No, that's a purely defensive, reactive approach to dealing with the problem. But you have to be able to deal with it in some way. So, yeah, TSS, big deal, and the T, it's the least essential part of the trio. As a matter of fact, a lot of classic TSS teams wind up dropping Toxic from their Pokemon. Like the classic example of Veteran and Love's Team Superman. A lot of it originally had Toxic Skarm and I think Toxic on one or two other guys. But like there are obviously a million permutations of that team. But eventually people started dropping Toxic from Skarm for other moves. Like G80 used to use a lot of Rest Talk Skarm. And I remember he said, you know, this technically isn't a TSS team anymore because there's no Toxic anywhere, but it still plays like one because it's all about the passive damage. So, and of course, Toxic is not exclusive to TSS stuff. It doesn't need Sand and Spikes to function. It is just greatly helped out by them. So, I mean, Toxic does the same as it ever does here. I mean, being able to put stuff on a timer is great. And you see a lot more Lumberries in this generation. You know, something like a mixed UD Tyranitar, mixed Tyranitar, would be a lot easier to deal with if you could just Toxic it and then Protect. Oh yeah, Protect is also really common, again, as a consequence of Toxic. The Toxic Protect combination is really popular in this tier, and really dominated the metagame for a time. You could Toxic Protect on almost anything. So, it's pretty simple. Toxic is straightforward, and you got Poison Immunes. I mean, Gengar is a huge deal because it blanks Toxic. You know, Jirachi, obviously, it's the Calm Mind Sweeper that is immune to Toxic, unlike Celebi and Suicune. So that's a really, really big deal. Helps it go one-on-one with Blissey a lot. And then there's, of course, Metagross, which, you know, is vulnerable to spikes, but it's not getting affected by Sand or Toxic, so it sticks around to harass bulky teams. The prominence of Toxic is such that Milotic pretty much never leaves the house without Refresh nowadays, because most people's response to Milotic used to be, oh, Toxic it. And then with Refresh, then they realize, oh, well, this has a million PP, way more than Toxic, so now we need it, and without being able to Toxic Milotic, then it becomes nearly indestructible, so yeah, that's Swampert doesn't run it as much nowadays, but used to run Refresh quite a bit as well for the same purpose. A lot of people's answer to Swampert used to be Toxic it. So, let's look at the Toxic users. Blissey uses it quite a lot, but also it doesn't really need it a lot of the time. I mean, look, it's a great move, obviously, but it has such a great move pool that it doesn't always, or it often doesn't even manage to fit it in. So, now I wouldn't bank the game on, oh, well, I really hope that Blissey doesn't have Toxic, because it's a move it can viably run. But you should be able to handle Blissey with Toxic anyway, because it's part and parcel of handling Blissey. Like, Snorlax and Metagross are good Blissey answers, whether or not it has Toxic, to give you an idea. So, yeah, Blissey runs Toxic, obvious reasons. Slow down the Tyranitar trying to switch in, put it on a timer, good with spikes, put things into finish range for something like Doug or Arrow. So, Blissey, good Toxic user. I mean, you could definitely make a case for Toxic on things like Celebi, and, you know, where I've tried Toxic Heracross. Passy has tried Toxic Heracross before as well. It's a good result. I remember he used it in World Cup 3 years ago, I think, against, was it Ojama? Yeah, I remember, and it's really nice on something like Heracross because it hits annoying pokes like Mence and Zapdos on the switch, and then you just spam Megahorn later on, and they're on a timer, so you can find, I mean, Toxic is learned by nearly everything, so you can find a niche for it on anything that isn't like a Magearna, which mysteriously does not learn it. But yeah, that's part of why Toxic is awesome, so we're going to go over them. Yeah, Blissey can use it. I mean, Celebi can use, I mean, Leech Toxic is just such a cool combination and so rare otherwise, so yeah, it can be worth making trying Toxic out on Celebi, but it can also be frustrating. You know, because Toxic doesn't do anything to things like Skarmory or Metagross. So, but you know, of course, it is really nice instead of, you know, temporarily leeching a T-Tar or a Mence or a Flygon, then Toxicing them. That is definitely really cool. So, definitely could be worth with some team support. It needs more exploration. Claydol doesn't really fit it. Cloyster doesn't really fit it. You know, I should take that out so it's not misleading. Flygon fits it on defensive sets. because it's not as offensively effective when it runs when it runs defensive sets, which make it like the sturdiest rock resistance in the tier. And it runs Protect because, like Swampert, that's its method of recovery. And what goes really well with Protect? Toxic, of course. And it also goes well with Flygon because it already likes Toxic, even on more offensive sets, to handle waters. And like Claydol, which also ran Refresh for a long time, which I think is a really bad set because it doesn't actually do anything to Skarm, which is very exploitable. And it needs Explosion, in my opinion. But that's what it does. It Toxics, and so when there was Refresh, sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. Toxic wasn't as effective when Refresh was everywhere. It was still a good move because you could force the Refresh, but it wasn't as dominant as it was prior to people responding to Toxic with Refresh, i.e. the most passive way possible. So, yeah, but Toxic is still good on Flygon. It's just such great reach. Like, it's not a perfect DD Mence answer, but, you Toxic it and it's, ruined. Same with Gengar or something, rather than having to Rock Slide them multiple times. So, just generally a great move you don't want to leave with the house without. And offensive Flygon can use it well as well. So, EQ, Rock Slide, HP Bug, and then if you have a Magneton, which you often will, then you can just slap Toxic in the last slot, and it's really effective. So, offensive and defensive Flygon use it really nicely. Fortress doesn't really fit it at all, actually. It's not like GSC. It really just can't use it anywhere. It's got Spin and Spikes and then a Hidden Power and Boom and Earthquake, which it didn't have in GSC. Earthquake, and yeah, it's just, Zap Cannon gets used more, like actually. So, yeah, you don't see Toxic Gengar because it has Will-O-Wisp, but yeah, we mentioned Toxic Heracross. Defensive Jirachi sets with Toxic are very popular because Protect, of course, and it has Fire Punch for Toxic immunities. So, yeah, finding Toxic immunities is really hard for a lot of offensive teams. It's why Toxic is such a nasty offensive weapon for balanced and defensive stuff. It's like, for example, for a while ago, like 3+ years ago, UD was using a lot of Weezing because it completely blanked Toxic Protect Skarmory, and that's really hard to find on offense. It blanked Spikes as well, because, Metagross doesn't get hit by Sand or Toxic, but it gets hit by Spikes, whereas Weezing switched into Skarmory easily, and unlike Gengar, it wasn't complete Pursuit T-Tar bait, so. But yeah, Toxic Jirachi obviously pairs really well with the Wish Protect combo and Fire Punch. Really great set, really simple, handles a lot. So, yeah. Magneton can use Toxic as a filler. Can be very annoying to certain teams, actually, because it has a Toxic immunity itself and a Sand immunity. So, it can do things like sit on Blissey and, not let it Swampert against TSS stuff with, like, Toxic lefties, HP Grass. So, that can potentially be really irritating for a lot of standard defensive teams. So, yeah, Magneton can use it to great effect. Metagross has used Toxic before really nicely. And it kind of stopped once once all the, Milo and Pert started refreshing all over the place. It still has its place, but it's harder to fit, generally. Now people focus more on damage and coverage to make up the difference. Like, rather than Toxicking Zapdos, you may as well Rock Slide and also hit something like Moltres. And then you just focus on EQing the waters and getting something out of that, rather than the one and done of Toxic. Not to say it can't still work, but it's generally not as easy to fit. I think now, actually, with Pert Refresh not being as common, then Toxic could still work really nicely. But it's definitely, you really need a heavy anti-Skarm, usually Mag, so it's going to be specific. It's going to be really specific even on an already specific requirement of Magneton, so. Yeah, Milo Tick runs the Surf Toxic combo is as classic as ever. And something like Gengar, like, it likes using its Toxic immunity when it can, but it can't do it forever because it doesn't heal in Sand. So it can't, like, block a Toxic from something like Milo because, in GSC it could make some good switches and, get some leftovers recovery, and that'd be nice. But here, it really can't do that. It really wants to avoid damage as much as possible. So it's got to be a lot more careful about using that Toxic immunity, and that's what makes Milo so irritating. It's got a really strong base stab surf, base 100, so even way stronger than Suicunes from GSC. And of course, things are not bulked out as much anymore, so because there are no more max EVs across the board in Gen 3. So, yeah, Milo, Surf, Toxic, Refresh, Recover, the definition of playing with and against Toxic. So, really, really nasty. And, yeah, that's why things like Snatch Blissey exist. So you Toxic the Milo, and then you snatch its attempts to refresh or recover. So, yeah, Milo never leaves the house. I mean, okay, there's some more offensive teams that like things like Hypnosis Milo and Ice Beam Milo, but on balanced stuff where Milotic traditionally fits, you run Refresh Toxic. That's what makes Milo what it is. Toxic puts the timer on Zapdos, which would otherwise be a pain, and Refresh means it is no longer put on a timer itself. Moltres, underrated Toxic user. Really, really nice for Blissey, because Blissey can heal off Will-O-Wisps, but since Toxic accumulates over time, then you might be able to force Blissey out, and they're probably not going to have another great Moltres answer besides Blissey. So, just a great move. You know, the Fire Toxic combination is great on Pokemon without Fire Stab, and Moltres, of course, has Fire Stab, so not always easiest to fit. Moltres has a lot of moves it wants to get into those last two slots after Fire Stab and HP Grass, including often another Fire Stab. You know, Flamethrower Overheat is usually the best combination. But yeah, Toxic is definitely worthwhile. And when you have Moltres on Moltres fights, then you love having Toxic, because they would absorb your Wisp and not be hit by spikes or anything. But Toxic, you just ruin them. So, P2 can run Toxic. Doesn't really run it as much anymore because, you know, it doesn't really do anything against Metagross and Snorlax, its most common switch-ins, especially Metagross, and or Jirachi, so it generally prefers T-Wave. But it can run it, but it's not really Porygon 2's defining trait. Men's can run Toxic really nicely. Like the classic Wish Toxic Protect Flamethrower set with Bold and Max Defense, one of the coolest sets ever. It runs Toxic again because it's not doing a lot offensively, it needs to be good defensively. It doesn't run Toxic as much on offensive sets. I mean, it could before, now I don't think it's really worth it. Because it used to be for Milotic, but now, since Milotic refreshes, then not really worth it. Whereas on the defensive set, then Toxic is just its move. It's move to, you know, slow down T-Tar or Zapdos or whatever. So, yeah, that set is really, really cool. And the Toxic Fire combination. Skarmory, Toxic used to be its bread and butter, and then the metagame adapted to it so hard that Skarmory was like, alright, I'll just drop Toxic and use other moves, and now I'm still going to destroy you. Like, Gengar using its Toxic immunity to switch into Skarmory doesn't work so well when it gets Drill Pecked. So, and it can still run Toxic, of course. Still a great set. It's still Skarmory. So, that one's really self-explanatory. Spikes Protect Whirlwind Toxic Skarmory had people calling for its ban for a while. So that was a dominant set. Yeah, Snorlax doesn't really use Toxic, but I do want to mention that Thick Fat Snorlax is terrible in advance and should never ever be used, because you're going to handle Charizard anyway, other non-stab Fire Blast, whatever, Moltres Will-O-Wisps you need immunity, because otherwise you switch into Blissey, you get Toxic, you know, and you can't even do it anymore, so it's really, really dumb, and you know, letting Skarmory's usually not going to try to Toxic you, but it's just not worth passing up on it. Immunity Snorlax always. Starmie is nice because it has Natural Cure and can pivot into Toxic, another nice thing about Blissey and Celebi, actually. And Suicune doesn't really... Well, offensive Suicune with Calm Mind, Hydro, Ice Beam, Toxic is really nice because it kind of plays like Moltres in that will go down, or... I noticed my mic cut out, but yeah, Toxic on offensive Suicune. Because either Blissey goes down, fighting you while Toxic to the +1/+2 Hydros, which are really strong, or something else gets switched in and gets absolutely blasted, because they're not going to have Blissey and another fantastic Suicune counter most of the time. So, Toxic offensive Suicune is very cool. Toxic Swampert, you know, of course, classic. Surf, Protect, Toxic, Filler, Roar, my favorite still. Rest, or not Rest, sorry, Refresh. Whatever you want, really. Ice Beam, Earthquake, Focus Punch. Yeah, it can do it all. So, Swampert is awesome, and often runs Toxic on its defensive sets. Toxic T-Tar did have McMegan used to run Taunt Toxic, Rock Slide EQ, and that was a beast of a set, because it used to be you Taunt Skarm, and then Pert switches in, and you Toxic that. And it, you know, stopped being as effective once they started refreshing everywhere. I know it has Taunt, but, you know, you run the risk of eating a big hit just to taunt its refresh attempt, so... But it's still a very cool set, and then people started using Crunch Pursuit Taunt Toxic, so you combine Pursuit T-Tar, and then you can still Toxic stuff that you're not going to be hitting hard otherwise. like Posing T-Tar or Blissey or something. So, but that one really requires like something like mag support, because you're, well, no, sorry, because you have Taunt for Skarm. But you don't have the EQ for something like Jirachi or Metagross, so it's hard to fit Toxic on T-Tar. Obviously, it can use it because T-Tar could use Hidden Power normal and still be good, but harder to fit. And then, of course, Zapdos. Zapdos can run Toxic on any set, offensive, defensive. Doesn't run it on offensive as much nowadays, although it's still a great set, especially Toxic Protect, the male set. That was a real monster. But it's more traditionally on T-Bolt, Toxic, Rest, and then filler, like Roar. Yeah, something like that. So, generally, if Zapdos is Toxic, it's going to be more defensive, but it can run it on offensive sets effectively as well. So then we go down to the BLs. I like Toxic Charizard. I think it's underrated for the same reasons as Moltres. But other than that, you don't really get a lot of toxic stuff down here. So, yeah. I mean, Vaporeon, I guess. But oh, Venusaur is really cool because it has a toxic immunity and a water resistance. So you're a really fantastic switch into things like Milo and Refresh Pert. So that's one of the coolest things about it. And of course, we already went over why Weezing's toxic immunity was really important for a time. All right, Gen 4. Even more passive damage because now Stealth Rock is everywhere, and there's even Toxic Spikes, but we're not going over that in this video. So, then there's, of course, well, it wasn't always the case, but as Clefable got more and more prominent, then slapping Toxic on things like Heatran, like a Toxic Heatran Subtoxic Heatran used to be just a great threat to pretty much everything. And then with Clefable popping up instead of Blissey, it just kind of became, almost useless. So that's a big reason why you don't see that set. And it used to be a nightmare for Stall. So, but yeah, you don't see Toxic slapped on as many Pokemon as you could in advance, really. But it's generally harder to fit because there are a lot of good new moves to be thrown around. Like also another Pokemon that used to use Toxic exclusively, Gliscor. Taunt Toxic Roost EQ was a classic Brit Score stall breaker. And now it hasn't used that for a long time. Not just because of Clefable, though, of course. It was mainly because of Breloom, which completely blanks that set. So Clef and Loom really threw a wrench in the classic DPP Toxic strategies of a decade ago. How I miss it. But yeah, and things like Hippo and Swampert aren't really using the move as much either. So yeah, Bliss, again, also less common. And even when it is used nowadays, it doesn't really use Toxic very much, but it, of course, used to use Toxic all the time. So yeah, there's a lot it can do. I mean, I think Toxic on Breloom is really good, really underrated, but it's not really a standard. Bronzong used to Toxic Protect quite a bit back when alternative Bronzong sets were being explored, but now it doesn't really fit it as much, again, because of Clef, and generally don't need it as much as you want. Things like Rocks and super effective coverage for stuff. EQ, Gyro, HP Ice, Boom, Payback. So that's good. Then there's Defensive Empoleon is really cool, but again, doesn't really fit Toxic. Doesn't do anything to help with its issues with Clef and Breloom. It's really more about things like Ice Beam and Knock Off and Roar. So I think that's a really interesting development. Toxic Flygon I think is really underrated, but it's hard to fit. I think an offensive Toxic Flygon is really good. Like, it's a great filler on Scarf. Like, I would use EQ, Turn, Outrage, Toxic. This is genuinely a great set. Not my invention. Smith, I remember, was the first guy I saw talking about and using it. But, Adamant or Jolly, whatever. It's genuinely great. Something like Hippo or Pert thinks it has a free switch, and you just Toxic it, and you make it shiny because it needs to be. But yeah, and you just Toxic it. Great for Gliscor, of course. Bulky Zapdos. So generally a nice way of making sure that Scarf Flygon can still threaten some defensive stuff, because it often falters against bulky stuff. So, and then you replace Outrage with Dragon Claw and just give it, oh, that should be Scarf. But yeah, if you make that Lefty as in Dragon Claw, then this Flygon set is also really nice on a lot of teams. So, for similar reasons, and it's of course got that great Rocks Resist, Spikes Immunity, Sand Immunity, so when you Toxic the Swampert or something, and you have that strong stab EQ, or the Gliscor, and you have the strong moves to really mess with Breloom and Clef, then it can be really irritating. But yeah, Toxic Scarfgon, I think, is a really cool set. Toxic wasn't really used on Fori. The Heist, or Babidi, was really the only guy I remember ever using Toxic for. He used Spikes, Toxic, Protect, Spin, and, it was cool and all when Gengar wasn't as common. And, you know, we had Scarftar for that. But, yeah, and it was actually quite irritating for things like Rotom. It was a much safer way of beating it down rather than paybacking and hoping for this. Because Toxic also hits other things, you know, like Waters and Zapdos and everything. So, but yeah, that was always niche at best. Gengar doesn't use it, likes its immunity, but yeah. Gliscor doesn't use it anymore. Gyarados, no. Heatran, not really anymore either. Hippo, no. Infernape, no. Jirachi used to use Subtoxic Ironhead Fire Punch, the Panamaxis set that Ray Scarface then made popular. I can't believe I still remember all this stuff. Yeah, 11 years ago. It was really nasty. You would Toxic something like Swampert, and then you really Iron Flinch it down because you only need a few, and Toxic damage racking up. It's nasty. I liked experimenting with Toxic Protect Ironhead Fire Punch. I thought that was really cool. Of course, you're totally worthless against Heatran, which is a big problem, but yeah, Jirachi doesn't really run Toxic as much. You're not going to see like Wish Protect Toxic stuff like you might sometimes in Ubers, but it can exist. It's just hard to fit on a team. I remember XCal was messing around with a really cool Wish Protect Toxic U-turn set, I think. I really like that one. Because that way, if you're facing something that is not going to take anything from your Toxics, then you just U-turn out. Yeah, Latios, when it was originally OU over a decade ago, then it was never using Toxic, and then it came back and you started seeing these Reflect Recover sets, and those eventually incorporated Toxic, so you ruin things like T-Tar, obviously that's the big one, and you are just threatening to bulky stuff in general. Obviously you need support against Clef, which, you know, that set gets completely blanked by, but that's going to be the case anyway, so. Yeah, Toxic Latias, very, very cool, very hard to deal with for a lot of offense. Like, if you're facing something like Machamp, rather than having to hit it multiple times, you Toxic it, and then you just heal. You reflect in its face, and it's taking damage while you're healing up and weakening its attacks, things like that. So, very cool. And, yeah, not a lot of Toxics going around here. Toxic Protect Magazine was popular for a time, a long time ago, but not anymore. Again, Clef just doesn't do enough. It wants to be doing other things. Has enough trouble fitting. I mean, if it's Scarf already and doesn't really want to fit it. It's got enough moves there, and with Magnet Rise, and you want Protect and Magnet Rise and Hidden Power, so. Yeah, Toxic Protect Metagross is actually quite cool, or I mean, you can even give or take the Protect, although you generally want Protect over Toxic. But also generally a nice set. Really irritating for a lot of offense, you know, Ruin Waters. I mean, you're not seeing Refresh in this gen, so. And with Mash and EQ, then you're destroying most Toxic immunes like Heatran, Jirachi, other Metagross. So you are generally getting that Toxic off on a Water or a Zapdos or a Rotom. So that way you can really cripple something like Gliscor or Hippo without having to explode, which is really, really valuable. So yeah, Toxic Metagross, hard to fit, but underrated, very good. You don't see it a lot on Rose or the Rotoms or Scizor or Skarm. Yeah, Skarm never Toxics anymore. It has, you know, Brave Bird or Taunt or... Yeah, those are pretty much it. But yeah, because it has Roost now. So Spikes, Whirlwind, Roost, and then Taunt or Brave Bird. I mean, or Stealth Rock if you want, but generally doesn't have Toxic. Doesn't really have the inclination for Toxic either. You know, I mean, I'm sure it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, but it's general. You have enough moves to be trying it to fit on Skarm anyway. Toxic Starmie, you know, possible, not really needed. If you really need a Toxic Appert that's going to try and stay on you, I guess. But it's generally not advisable. Suicune doesn't Toxic anymore. Pert, no. T-Tar, I really love Toxic T-Tar. One of my favorite sets for a while was Rocks, Toxic, Protect, and then Crunch. And you can... I mess around with everything. I ran a No Attacks, Toxic, Protect, Roar, T-Tar. That was awesome. But yeah, Toxic Tar in general is awesome. As long as you run it... You just run it like a defensive poke. Almost like a Hippowdon. And you run Protect and you run Toxic, so you ruin things like offensive Swampert switching in and Gliscors, and it's really nice. So Toxic Tar, hard to fit, not for every T-Tar, far from it actually. You have to be very well equipped against things like Breloom and Skarmory, but really, really nice when it does hit. And of course Toxic Zapdos, harder to fit. I mean, used to be Subaru's Toxic T-Bolt was like the gold standard Zapdos set, but then... that set started kind of dying out, especially once Nidoqueen started getting popular. So you still can run like T-Bolt, HP Ice, Roost, Toxic, and be irritating, because that way you can like, your T-Bolts are really strong, so Clef is uncomfortable. And you can do things like Pursue It or Knock It Off to make it even harder to switch in. And then you Toxic the Swampert or the Latias, so potentially very irritating set. But, you know, hard to fit sometimes. But yeah, if you can get Toxic on Zapdos, it's obviously going to put in a lot of work. You ruin T-Tar, of course. So... Yeah, then in the lower tiers, then you don't really see much. I know Clef isn't really a lower tier at all, but it can run Toxic. I mean, it's good for things like T-Tar and like offensive Swampert, but doesn't really run it a lot. Prefers Knockoff because again, other Clef. So yeah, that's more or less it. Oh, Milo obviously Serve Toxic. It doesn't refresh anymore because it needs Ice Beam or Haze. Actually, no, I take that back. Milo isn't even Toxic most of the time anymore. It's usually Ice Beam and Haze. Toxic is really the luxury at this point. So, as we've noticed, Toxic is really, it's still a great option, obviously, in a lot of Pokemon. But it's far from the near automatic thing that you would see in the previous 2 generations. So, that's more or less it. And Nidoqueen doesn't really run I have enjoyed Toxic Nidoqueen instead of Toxic Spikes because that way you hit things like Gyarados that you otherwise wouldn't, or something irritating like Zapdos trying to go one-on-one with you. But definitely niche for sure. And oh, Toxic is also really nice on Nidoqueen in case they have something like a Roserade and pick up your T-Spikes. This way you still get a Toxic the Pert. So I think that's really underappreciated. So now we're going to move on to Gen 5, and I'm going to take another bathroom break because I really hydrated well in this one, or before this one. So BRB. I should really become like Dwight in that episode of The Office where he requires hands-free hydration. Just watched that episode yesterday, actually. I don't care much for season 6 or 7. I mean, they're still fine, but just not the same. Anyway, Toxic spamming becomes even harder in Gen 5 because you get a lot of really great immunities. I mean, Magic Guard is Zan is one thing, so you don't really want to be toxicing that anyway. Although it would be a lot easier if you could. But it's things like Poisonal Gliscor is huge. And then there's another Magic Guarder, Reuniclus. So, of course, Toxic was super prominent throughout the generation. Heatran used to use it a lot and stuff, but it's really been phased out over the years. I mean, Tentacruel uses Toxic a lot because T-Spikes often doesn't hit much, and Toxic allows you to do things like directly threaten Jellicent and Rotom, as opposed to just T-Spiking and being walled forever by Jelly and never doing anything to Rotom. Because Jellicent switches in on the first layer and it'll never die. And it'll Will-O-Wisp you. And yeah, so Toxic is just good and direct and lets you instantly threaten things like Latios as well. But that's like the most prominent use by far. And it's really kind of been phased out of other stuff because you don't really want to be toxicing as much in such a fast-paced metagame with Gliscor. I mean, Gliscor used to run Sub-Toxic Protect EQ. That used to be its bread and butter set. Yes, keep playing. But then that players used to adapted to that, with their own Gliscors even, or like Reuniclus, and they've really kind of phased out Toxic on Gliscor, and I mean, it's still viable, of course, and same with Heatran, but they've really gone the same way. So, Toxic Dice's set, Scald, Protect, Toxic, Secret Sword, Keldeo, that was really nasty for a time, but then that also started having problems like it can't spit off Skarmory and Gliscor as much, and it gets walled by Reuniclus, so yeah, I mean, it's still good. It's still a very good set, obviously, but it's definitely not. Toxic just isn't the spammable move it once was. So metagame just moves really fast, and there are and in slower paced games, then there are so many options for good absorption. So, yeah, there's that. That's honestly, this was a lot shorter than I expected. I like things like Toxic Thunderous, especially with Protect, because it does things like lure in annoying pokes for like Rain, like Latios is the biggest one, and then of course there's Gastrodon, who's also annoying, and it can also be nice to cripple T-Tar and like force out something like Celebi, but it's just not as easy to fit and get something out of. I mean, even Politoed, its standard defensive set used to be Scald, Protect, Toxic, and Filler, just because those are good moves. And now it pretty much never uses Toxic anymore. I mean, it can, but it's harder to fit because you're going to be facing things like Bulky Poisonal Breloom and Reuniclus, and you just want other moves. You want that Encore, you want Refresh for burns, for Scald burns, because, I mean, another Toxic immunity is, of course, Tentacruel itself. So then there's the Scald Wars instead, not to say nothing of Rotom Wash's Will-O-Wisp and Heatran's Lava Plume. So, yeah, you want Refresh, and you want Encore. Hell, sometimes you want Ice Beam, because Chomp and D-Knight are annoying. So, yeah, you know, most of the time you consider something like Haze or Perish Song before you consider Toxic on it. So, yeah, that's pretty much it for Toxic in this gen. I mean, not that it's bad or anything, but you don't really see it a lot. And even if we go down through the lower tiers, then, yeah, I mean, it's really more about the burn in this generation. That's for sure. So, yeah. Alright, so now we move on to Gen 6. And, again, I mean, Clef is really good now, but you have so many good options to deal with Toxic now. I mean, Gliscor is also amazing as ever, so, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence. I mean, of course it's not a coincidence, I don't think. Like, this is some sort of new revelation. Good job, Kev. But yeah, Clef and Gliscor are really just so good, and they're also so resilient against passive damage. That's part of why they're good. You can't just slap a Toxic on and be like, oh, well, you know, forget that. So, yeah, Clef and Gliss, completely Toxic immune, and then you have, of course, Gen 5's Ferrothorn. I didn't even mention Ferrothorn before. Another reason why Gen 5 is so burn-focused. And Gen 6, of course, continues in the Scald and Will-O-Wisp tradition. So, yeah, Clef, Gliscor, Excadrill, Mega Diancie with a Magic Bounce, you know, Heatran, Jirachi. Well, Jirachi's not that common, but I was just listing... Mega Metagross, obviously. Yeah, I really want to be spamming Toxic in this tier. Not to say that Toxic is bad, of course, but... like, look at the Pokemon in the tier. You're generally not spamming the move very much. And, I mean, yeah, you can, but you generally don't really think of it. It's not something... I mean, something like Toxic Clefable can work, and, you know, Toxic Heatran is rarely outright bad, but generally you prefer things like Phasing and Knockoff and Taunt. I don't know. It's just not really easy. The best Toxic user... I can really think of is Toxic Excadrill, because that way, if Gliscor switches in, you can spin, and if anything else switches in, like a Slowbro or something, you can still spin. But you ruin Jellicent, which is really nice, and actually being able to Toxic Slowbro is really valuable for a lot of teams. Not letting Slowbro answer Excadrill can be really nice. And even then, Toxic is not exactly an essential move on Drill. You want EQ, Spin, Iron Head for Clef, and then usually Rocks or SD. Toxic can work there, sure, of course, but it's not really something you use. Garchomp is a good Toxic user, but even then, it's often going to be met with Gliscor or Clef, and you're like, you know, why am I even bothering? I may as well just run Roar so I can phase out Sub-Suicunes and Sub-Superiors and not get blocked by Clef like Dragon Tail would. Oh, and Sub, of course. So... then you want, you know, EQ obviously, and then something like Fire Blast or a Rock move for Volk and Zard Y. So yeah, I don't know. Garchomp's okay. I do like Toxic Protect on Garchomp simply because I like Lefty's Chomp sometimes over Rocky Helmet. The longevity is really nice against Excadrill, especially. Another reason Toxic is going to Excadrill for Garchomp. And then you run Lefties, and then you run Protect, and then when you run Protect, you often want Toxic, so that way you also ruin Zard Y, and you ruin a Slowbro, or a Rotom. Chomp goes one-on-one with the Rotom quite a bit. So, yeah, you can run it, but even then, sometimes I don't even feel like I need the Toxic. I would rather have the coverage move, so... And matter of fact, Toxic Excadrill is another reason why Rock's Gliscor is awesome. Totally dumps on it. So, yeah, you're just not really seeing Toxic as much in this gen. I mean, there was a time a long time ago where things like Toxic Keldeo and Jirachi were pretty cool, and I think they still probably have their little place. But Jirachi, hard to fit. Keldeo, you know, also hard to fit. A lot more prediction reliant than an outright coverage move like HP Grass. So, yeah, Subtoxic Lando, that used to be cool, and then, you know, it's like, oh, well, Gliscor destroys this. And I'm sure you could run Subtoxic HP Ice EQ, but then you got to deal with Clef and Skarm, and not to mention that HP Ice doesn't even do very much to Gliscor. So yeah, it's tough. It's really tough to get Toxic going in this gen. So Not that it's bad or anything, but it's, yeah, tough to get going quite a lot of the time. So, and even if we look into the lower tiers, you're not really seeing anything that you want to bring to OU to start toxicking stuff. The biggest change that that Toxic had in Gen 6 was that if a poison type uses Toxic, it is now impossible for it to miss. I think like +6 evasion, Sand Veil, Poke, and Sand, holding Bright Powder, will still be hit by a poison type using Toxic. So, Gen 7, of course, brings the mother of all Toxic users and absorbers. So you get, with Toxapex, you get both Scald Wars and unmissable Toxic spam. And honestly, I think Toxic is part of what makes Toxapex so nasty, because something like a Torn, I mean, even if you're pivoting in and out with something like a Torn, then yeah, you don't mind the reduced burn damage as much, and so you can stay in, but you generally don't want to stay in and press your luck against Toxapex, even if you got things like Knock and Taunt, if you're Toxic, because it's really going to rack up, and that's way more exploitable. Whereas Scald is, the burn reduction to 6% a turn is not much at all. So Toxic really makes Toxapex nasty for things like Lottie Twins as well. Like Payappa, Toxapex to ruin them, and Mega Zam. Toxic really just makes... I mean, obviously Toxapex does not need to run Toxic. Obviously, it's really successful even without it. But honestly, I think a big part of what makes Toxapex so nasty is its ability to Toxic stuff. So, that's the biggest Toxic user in Gen 7, of course. And it manages to succeed because it scalds things that other Pokemon... that scalds most of the stuff that won't get Toxic, like Ferrothorn. It has Knockoff to accentuate those. Can do all sorts of stuff. Another reason Gliscor is so popular. So, yeah, Gen 7 got a lot of good Toxic immunities, but also a lot of Toxic vulnerable Pokemon. And, of course, Pex is so unbreakable, it's like, whoops, I ate that Kyurem Black Fusion Bolt and I Toxiced it, so it's crippled forever, and I'm going to switch out and regenerate. So, that's Pex. There are a lot of cool applications. Like, I really like that Subtoxic Mega Swampert that was used on Rain for a while, because it cripples things like, well, I think it was originally used for Shedinja, but it's nice for something like Tangrowth, just to permanently ruin it, or Tapu Bulu, or even other Pelipper, Mega Latias that is going to try and stave it off. So it's generally a cool move on that. So you see more of a Toxic resurgence in Gen 7. Heatran's a great user of it, obviously, with Magma Storm, and Z-moves powering it up, and then something bulky tries to switch in, and it gets poisoned. So, and of course, there's Tapu Fini and its Misty Surge, which are really nice in the fight against Toxic. Like, you have Misty Surge and you go to a Z Garchomp, and then Pex can't really hurt it because of Misty Surge protecting against both statuses. So you got to be careful about switching Fini in when Toxic Spikes go up, though, obviously, because they don't. Misty Surge going up doesn't protect against T-Spikes. So that's another reason why Toxic T-Spikes Pex is so good. But yeah, I mean, the Tapus are Toxic vulnerable. If you've looked so far, you see a lot of Toxic vulnerable pokes here. I mean, Kyurem, Como, Greninja, obviously, that's a big one. And a lot of the Toxic immune Pokemon are, Scald vulnerable. So, I mean, not Clef and Gliscor, obviously, but, that's why Pex has teammates, and, of course, other moves. I still think Gastro Acid Pex is underrated as hell. So, yeah, that's pretty much it as far as Toxic stuff goes. Toxic Torn is really cool, like when it's for things like, what's the thing? Coco, obviously, and Zapdos when that's really popular. Just generally a nice move in general for things like Gastro. So, obviously not a standard or anything, but it can be used to great effect. And, Toxic Protect Como O is really cool as well. I really like that set. I forget, it was a French guy who made it. I think it was Corey 2600. I'm not 100% on that. I like to give credit, but yeah, Toxic Como O, really cool. So you definitely see a resurgence of Toxics in Gen 7. Rock's Toxic Gliscor, a favorite. Rock's Toxic Roost DQ. Really love that set. So lots of cool Toxic stuff you can run. So Excadrill doesn't really run as much anymore, really. More about the Z stuff or the Suicide lead stuff. But yeah, not Garchomp as much either. Helmet, popular for a little bit, but it really went back to the Z stuff really quickly. So yeah, Gliscor, Pex, Como, those are really the big... Oh, Heatran, obviously, those are the big ones. I think I've seen stuff like Toxic Mega Scizor before, and I think I saw Toxic Coco once or twice, but It's harder to fit on a lot of pokes, and Torn, the nicher stuff like Torn and what was the other thing? Swampert. But yeah, harder to fit, but still, you definitely see more of a Toxic resurgence in this gen. And it's really easy to make a team without realizing that Toxapex or something is just going to Toxic you and sit on you. So, gotta be careful. But yeah, and in the lower tiers, you're not really seeing a lot of Toxicing pokes. For OU purposes anyway. So yeah, being immune to the stuff and being able to dish it out is really important. Not being able to dish it out if you're running offense, obviously, but even Rain offense can sometimes run Toxic Perp, so really cool stuff. Alright, and that's pretty much everything, because I don't follow Gen 8. So thank you guys for watching. I hope this was useful for you in some way. I hope you enjoyed learning about the history of Toxic and how it continues to be used today in the first 7 generations. So thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you next time.